Boker Tov, Chavirim, and it's time for another session of Heartfelt Haftarah. Did you notice how I just moved? That's that sudden move. That's pausing. So anyway, we continue. We've now moved on to the third of the five books of Moses, Vayikra, or the book of Leviticus. And Vayikra also happens to be the name of the first Torah portion that we'll read on a weekly basis. That is in keeping with the rather simple but slightly confusing traditional custom of naming a portion or a book or virtually anything after the first significant word that appears in the portion. So Vayikra is actually the first word that appears in the book of Leviticus, and he called, or then he called. That Vav does so many different tasks. So anyway, our Haftarah portion is going to be Isaiah 43. So let's do a little bit of tent peg business and talk about what we're going to be reading from a more historical contextual basis, and then we'll go on to explore the actual themes in it. So let's talk about the history of Isaiah, the textual history of Isaiah, and the problems that it creates for us. So by all evidence, the early part of the book of Isaiah is a priest who gets a prophetic calling in the temple. Happens in chapter 6. We've talked about it. And this is all unfolding in the late 8th, early 7th century BCE, at a time when the Judean kingdom is standing alone and threatened not only by forces to the east and forces to the northeast, but even by its northern brethren, the kingdom of Israel. Just because America and Canada get along doesn't mean that two kingdoms that share the same language and pretty much overlapping theology were going to get along in the ancient world. They didn't. So anyway, that's the Isaiah that we're introduced to at the very beginning. But then there are radical shifts in tone throughout the rest of the book, beginning at Isaiah 40, and again, it has been argued happening around Isaiah 60. There are 66 chapters overall. So look at the simplest supposed answer is that Isaiah is the author of all of these works, and that his prophetic ability extends to not only the Babylonian exile, but beyond the Babylonian exile. If that were really the simplest explanation, then there'd be nothing to talk about. The problem is that the simple explanation, that it's all the work of one author, creates a whole set of problems in itself, which means it's not the simplest explanation. A slightly simpler explanation for all the shifts in style, voice, rhetoric, and theme and topic are the result probably of there being at least two and possibly three different contributors to what we today know as the book of Isaiah. So 40 is the place where things shift. Up until 40, Isaiah is just, a mean girl in the prophets. He's got a lot of nasty things to say about the people of Israel, oftentimes in very exalted rhetoric. But then at around chapter 40, the voice shifts radically to a voice of comfort and reassurance. And it takes on a best described as a global perspective, something that we would expect in a modern monotheistic world where you're talking about God as the sole ruler over all of the known world. That is not really the interest of Isaiah before 40, et cetera, et cetera. And then we go downright apocalyptic in the last couple of chapters, where we are describing not the restoration of the people and their comfort, but a global transformation that is put in very startling terms. I would call it a style of apocalyptic literature, which again breaks with the previous two sections that we're looking at. And so it looks like there might be a third author, all right, or a third contributor or whatever. So the most popular theory about this is that Isaiah was not only a founding prophet, but he created essentially a school of prophets or an inspired circle of disciples who continued on into the Babylonian exile and at its return. And so the word Isaiah may not just mean one prophet, but actually a prophetic movement. Think, for example, of Wesleyans. John Wesley established Methodism, but people will still speak of Wesleyan theology and Wesleyan teachings, even though he may not have written them himself. And so we may be dealing with something along those lines. In any case, what we're doing now is we're going to be in Isaiah 43, and we're getting into the voice of what is often called Deutero Isaiah, because we can't say it in English, we got to say it in Greek. Second Isaiah, Deutero Isaiah. And we're hearing a very, very important message. Now, let me think, is there anything else I want to say about this from a tent peg point of view? Okay, no, so let's go on and look at how this particular passage is selected to go with the Torah portion and what it's trying to communicate. So tent peg goes away, in case you didn't see it the first time. And we move now to the actual text itself. Now remember that Vayikra, the Torah portion, is talking about the procedures for making material offerings, the korbanot. The material sacrifices, big focus on animals, and we're told about the many different categories of sacrifices: sin offerings, guilt offerings, Thanksgiving offerings, Hagiga, holiday offerings, the Tamid, the continual offering, the burnt offering, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a whole typology of sacrifices. Now, I think it's important to note that up to this point, when describing the construction of the Mishkan, the rabbis go out of their way to find passages from the prophets that parallel what is being described in the Torah portion. So when it comes to the building or the dimensions or the features of the portable sanctuary, the Haftarot are about the dimensions and the functions and the construction of Solomon's temple, or a temple beyond that. Now, however, the focus becomes radically different. As soon as we get down into the weeds about the sacrificial system, about the offerings that are to be made, the Haftarah stops taking an interest in this. I think that's quite deliberate. And in fact, one could describe Isaiah 43 as slightly contrasting to that, because as much as our Torah portion emphasizes the material and animal offerings, the blood sacrifices, etc., our Haftarah portion begins by Isaiah sort of downgrading that concept, saying, look, you've been making sacrifices to me for hundreds of years, and what has it got you? The problem is, it's not about mechanically making offerings. It's about you changing your heart. The offerings are only meant to be a symbol of what is going on inside of us. And you fail to do that, You fail to understand that this was not simply a rote behavioral way of worship, that what it was really calling you to do was to be righteous and fair and honest in your dealings and kind to each other and loving to your fellow Israelites, and recognizing God's sovereignty over all humanity. So this is a radical shift. If I were to summarize it, I would say that the rabbis wanted us to understand that the temple was very important, but the sacrifices not so much. And I've made this point on a number of other occasions. I'm sure I've made it here at some point or another that unlike the widely held perception within Christianity, that it is the sacrifices that are central to Israelite worship and culture, and therefore you need to have a sacrifice substitute to keep the system operating in the absence of the temple, which, lo and behold, happens to be Jesus of Nazareth. That's not really what's going on in ancient Israel. The key to the idea of the temple and its functioning is not the sacrifices of blood, the death of animals. It is the big building next to the sacrificial system. That is the fact that God has an apartment among the Israelites. You know, God may live in New Jersey, or as we would call it, the heavens, but he has an apartment midtown, or in the middle of Jerusalem. And what we're really interested is not sacrificing and killing in order to stave off punishment for ourselves, but rather to create an environment where God will be close to us. And so the parallels to having, hosting a guest are you provide him with a nice apartment, you give him a staff, you provide him with a cafeteria. Again, I think we have to not get too caught up in the literalism of that. But the idea is not blood sacrifices, but God's proximity, having a residence in the midst of the people. Now, it feels kind of concrete to us when we talk about being close to God, but it apparently really worked for the ancient Israelites. But it's not the same thing that what Christians think it is. So, and Isaiah highlights this. He says it's not really the sacrifices themselves. If you're focusing on that, you're focusing on the wrong thing. And so in 43 and subsequently, Isaiah does something different. Instead, he actually pushes the Israelites to understand that what they see before their eyes is not the big deal. And in fact, shortly after he downgrades the sacrifices at the beginning of the Haftarah portion, what he does next is he then creates a rhetorical vignette in which people are making idols. And they go through this elaborate process of making idols, and then they make the fundamental mistake up until the point where it's the idol is completed. The craftsman is the master of the product in his hand, and only after we render it into an image, suddenly it becomes divine, and we submit ourselves to it. And how stupid is that? Right? So the same thing, I think, is meant to be going on here. Don't make an idol out of the sacrifices. Don't think that God's spirituality stops at the sacrificial altar. You have to go to the actual sanctuary and to the Holy of Holies to really understand the essence of what God is asking for you, asking of you. And what God is asking of us is be righteous, be kind, be compassionate, be a holy society, and make every effort to keep God close to you. And that's not making sacrifices. So that's at the heart of the whole thing. But I do want to draw a special attention to something else. Since I did talk a little bit about how the contrasting Jewish versus Christian understanding of what the sacrifices represent, I want to call attention to this because in about 10 verses, 10 chapters, not verses, 10 chapters, we're going to bump into one of the most famous and most celebrated Christological passages in Isaiah. That is to say, that it's a passage that has been read by Christians and it is absolutely enshrined in their imagination as definitive prophecy of the coming of Jesus. And this is Isaiah 53. And Isaiah 53 doesn't actually specify the subject of what it's talking about. It talks about a character who is going to suffer and then return in triumph and represents a kind of salvific figure for everyone. And Christians point to that and say, that's Jesus, right? And I'll tell this story. I'm sure I've told it 1,000 times, but I'll tell it again because it's my story. I did a lecture back in New Mexico before I even went to rabbinical school on the prophets to a joint group of Jews and Catholics. We were teaching Jewish and Catholic educators. And after I was done, these two lovely nuns come up to me and they say, in the sweetest possible way, that was wonderful, but we just don't understand why Jews don't see that Isaiah 53 is talking about Jesus. It's so self-evident. And to agree, it's understandable. That's everything they've ever been taught. They read Isaiah as a foreshadowing of Christ, and therefore everything's about Jesus. But I had to demur, and I had to say, well, that's not quite right. I could have had some clever bon mot. I didn't come up with it at the moment. I was a little caught off guard. But instead, I said, well, we think that Isaiah 53 is talking about the Israelite people, the Jewish people. It seems very self-evident to us, and we don't quite understand how Christians don't see that. I don't recall how the conversation went after that, but I'm not sure it went well. In any case, what we need to understand about Isaiah 53, which does in some ways feel like it has thematic parallels to the story of Jesus, the first thing we have to remember is that Isaiah came first and the narrative of Jesus came second. So one could uncharitably suggest that the account of Jesus's life has been shaped and molded in such a way that it resembles Isaiah 53. So it really does, it isn't evidence of much of anything. But more important than that is context. And that's what brings us back to our Haftarah. So I'm going to read to you just a very short passage from 44. And this is not the first time this couplet of ideas happens. It happens repeatedly starting around 41, and it continues all the way up to the moment where we get to Isaiah 53, where Isaiah starts talking about my servant, unspecified. So this is a contextual reading. It goes on for 10 chapters. And I think that's not an accident, and it's a mistake to read Isaiah 53 in isolation. This is the passage. Listen to me now, O Jacob, my servant, Israel, my chosen one. Thus says the Eternal One, your Maker, who formed you from the womb and will help you. Have no fear, Jacob, my servant, Yeshurun, my chosen one. All right, so Isaiah switches synonyms. Yeshurun is not a word that we're terribly familiar with today, but it's another equivalent to Israel and Jacob. All right, so but this is the couplet. Israel, Jacob, Jacob, Israel, my servant, my chosen one. This couplet reiterates itself in each and every chapter right up to Isaiah 53. So if you're wondering who the heck the servant is being described in Isaiah 53, it's us. And I'm not being arrogant. It's just a clear contextual reading that the idea that Isaiah is conveying in 53 is that we are chosen, but we are not chosen for material benefit. We're going to suffer. We're going to suffer for our faith. People are going to treat us badly. It seems ridiculous from the outside perspective of other peoples and other nations that God takes us seriously, and yet, lo and behold, we're going to keep coming back. We're not going to. They think we're buried, and we're not. And we are going to end up through our service and our devotion. We are going to end up being a light to the nations, a gift to the world. And that's my contextual reading, starting here in 43 and going all the way to 53. And I think we need to remember this if we ever find ourselves engaged in those unintentionally, I didn't want to be here, polemical discussions with Christians about what the Bible says and doesn't say. And the other key thing that I want to add to this, just to wrap things up, is that chosenness in general in Isaiah 43 and 44 is not a gift of prosperity, success, the promise that we're going to rule over other nations. The modern term I think about that is often used is Herrenvolk. I can say it, Herrenvolk. That is that somehow one ethnic group is superior to another. Of course, this is the root of German racism and racism in general around the world. Isaiah is not telling us that chosenness in Jewish tradition is about being a Herrenvolk. It is about being chosen for service. It's about being chosen to deal with adversity for the sake of others. It's about choosing to play a role in the world that is not going to be easy, but is going to be necessary to make the world better for everyone. So this is key to this particular Haftarah, and I think it's key to the Jewish self-understanding of being Am Segulah, a choice people, a treasured people, a chosen people, however you want to translate Segulah, and there are multiple ways to translate it. And we're often clubbed over the head for the idea that we're arrogant because we call ourselves a chosen people. But understand what it means. It means that God has chosen us to serve and, if necessary, though that's not the intention, to suffer. So I'm going to stop there and let you reflect on that. It's not the most exciting thing to learn that suffering is part of the package of being Jewish, but that is the message that Isaiah has for us, along with the idea that closeness to God and not mechanical sacrifice is the essence of Jewish spirituality. So mull on that, and we'll see you again next week.